Electronic pop did not appear from nowhere. Many different musicians across several countries helped shape its early direction, and there were far more pioneers than can be covered in a single video. For this documentary, I have chosen to highlight a group of artists whose work made a clear and lasting impact on what would later become known as synthpop. Their influence was not always recognized at the time, yet together they helped create the sound that defined the 80s. Before anyone called it synthpop, before newspapers and labels created a name for the movement, a handful of musicians were already building the sound that would define the 80s. In the mid-70s, most people still thought of pop as guitars, drums, and sweaty rehearsal rooms. Yet in a few studios in Germany, Japan, Sheffield, and London, something entirely new was taking shape. At the time, it felt strange, almost accidental. Only later did it become clear that these early ideas would lead directly to synthpop. A natural place to begin is with Kraftwerk. In 1974, they released Autobahn, a long, hypnotic piece built almost entirely from electronic instruments. It was unlike anything else in popular music, yet it reached mainstream listeners and proved that electronic sound could be both experimental and accessible. Over the next few years, they released albums like Trans-Europe Express and The Man Machine. Built on simple melodies, drum machines, and sequencers, these records quietly became blueprints for the new electronic language that would follow. Many later artists would say that Kraftwerk rewired their sense of what pop could be. Around the same time in Munich, Giorgio Moroder was working with Donna Summer on a track that pushed electronic music even further. In 1977, they released I Feel Love, built almost entirely on a single synthesizer pulse. There were no guitars, no live drums, and very little in the way of traditional arrangement. It was cold, hypnotic, and futuristic, and its success proved that a fully electronic track could drive a dance floor. Many musicians now look back on it as the moment modern electronic pop truly began. Meanwhile, in Japan, Yellow Magic Orchestra were developing their own approach. Using synthesizers, sequencers, drum machines, and early computer sounds, they created bright, playful electronic music with strong melodies. Their single computer game became an unexpected international hit and showed that electronic pop did not need to be serious or abstract. It could be witty, charming, and still deeply inventive. Their work quietly influenced many groups who would later define synthpop in the West. These innovations set the stage, but the story becomes very British once we reach the late 70s. In the industrial cities of the UK, especially Sheffield and London, young musicians were picking up cheap synthesizers and exploring new ideas. In Sheffield, Cabaret Voltaire were among the first to experiment with homemade electronics, tape loops, and processed sound. Although their early music was rough and often described as industrial, they always saw it as a form of experimental pop. Their attitude encouraged other musicians in the city to explore electronic ideas, and they helped create an environment where the next steps in synth-based music could flourish. From this same landscape came the Human League. Formed in 1977, they relied on synthesizers and taped rhythm tracks rather than guitars. Their early single Being Boiled, released in 1978, was stark, cold, and mechanical, yet it clearly functioned as a pop song. It did not fit neatly into any existing genre, which made it feel genuinely new. When people speak about the first examples of British synthpop, they often return to these early Human League recordings. In London, Daniel Miller was working on something equally important. Inspired by science fiction and by the style of German electronic music, he bought a small synthesizer and recorded a track in his flat. The result was Warm Leatherette, released under the name The Normal in 1978. Its robotic vocal and simple electronic rhythm became hugely influential in underground circles. The song showed that you did not need expensive equipment to make powerful electronic music. It also helped launch Mute Records, which would later become one of the central labels of British electronic pop. At the same time, Ultravox were undergoing a creative transformation. With John Foxx as frontman, they moved away from art rock and into a colder, more electronic direction. Their 1978 album, Systems of Romance, blended synthesizers with heavily treated guitars, creating a sound that was not quite synthpop, but that clearly pointed the way forward. Many later musicians would credit that album with helping to shape the electronic style that followed. It is at this point that Gary Numan enters the story, and his role is crucial. While the early pioneers laid the foundation, Numan was the first to turn electronic music into a mainstream phenomenon in Britain. In 1979, he released Our Friends Electric with Tubeway Army. The song was built on a heavy synthesizer riff and a detached vocal delivery, and it became a #1 single. A few months later, he followed it with Cars, a fully electronic track that also reached #1. For the first time in British pop history, a chart-topping artist was performing music driven entirely by synthesizers. Numan had been inspired by Kraftwerk and by the John Foxx era of Ultravox, but he took those ideas into a place no one else had reached. He showed that the public was ready for a new kind of pop star. He was not hiding the machines. He was celebrating them. His success opened the door for the next generation of electronic bands, giving confidence to acts like Depeche Mode, OMD, Soft Cell, and the later version of the Human League. When we look at all these artists together, a clear pattern emerges. Kraftwerk and Moroder proved that electronic music could carry melody and rhythm. Yellow Magic Orchestra showed that it could be charming and inventive. Cabaret Voltaire, the Human League, the Normal and Ultravox explored its possibilities within the British landscape. Gary Numan then took all these ideas and brought them into the mainstream, proving that electronic pop could succeed at the highest level. None of these musicians believed they were inventing a new genre. They were responding to the world around them. They were influenced by punk, by art school, by science fiction, and by the grim reality of late 70s Britain. They worked with cheap, unreliable machines and made music that sounded unlike anything that had come before. Many of their experiments were messy and confusing at the time, yet together they shaped the electronic language that would dominate the 80s. By the time bands like Depeche Mode, Soft Cell and OMD reached the charts in the early 80s, the groundwork had already been laid. The clean electronic rhythms and cool vocal styles of classic synthpop were the product of years spent in small studios, basements and bedrooms, long before anyone had a name for what they were creating. So when we talk about the bands who invented synthpop before synthpop existed, we are really talking about a chain of experiments across several countries. A German group imagining the motorway as music, a producer in Munich turning a synthesizer pulse into a global song, a Japanese trio mixing technology with melody, a group of British musicians using cheap synthesizers to express the mood of their cities, and finally an artist who took all these ideas to the top of the charts and made the world pay attention. They did not have a blueprint. They had curiosity, imagination, and a desire to make the future audible. And years later, when we listen to the polished synthpop of the 80s, we are hearing the echoes of their early work, created long before the genre had a name.